looks like we're going to get started here. We still have some people coming in, but let's move on. So welcome again. Today is our planning webinar series. Today it's zoning amendment time again. This webinar is being recorded and your cameras and your microphones are muted until you have a question. But let's move along for the, where's my mouse? Move along for some webinar logistics. Like I said, your cameras and your microphones are going to be muted. But if you'd like to ask a question, you can utilize the chat box or by raising your hand. And what I will do today is that if a question comes up on point to a particular topic that I'm talking about on a slide, if there's any questions, then I'll take those questions quickly at that time. Other than that, questions will be done at the end of the session. So again, it's zoning amendment time again. My name is Stephanie Verdallo. I'm a principal planner with the Office of Planning and Development. With me today is Alvina Snigach. She is our assistant planner. She's going to be running the chat for us and helping us out with questions. So the agenda today is going to review how and why we have zoning, the zoning ordinance's relationship to other municipal regulations, what is an amendment, what should be considered for amendment, best practices to be doing for zoning amendments, the legislative process, the ballot requirements, notification requirements, as well as some legislative changes that apply to zoning that happened in 2022. So why do we have zoning? The starting point for the creation of modern zoning happened in New York City in 1916. The culprit was the construction of the Equitable Building. And as you can see from the picture, this building towered over the neighboring buildings and residences. It completely filled the entire lot. It went right to the property lines. As a result, the building blocked the windows, blocked the air, blocked sunshine, blocked light, and it was a real negative impact, health and safety-wise, for the abutting properties and the abutting buildings in the neighborhood. So what happened as a result of that is this building just being built, without any types of restrictions or regulations or limitations. The city of New York enacted the first municipal zoning regulations in the country in 1916. So New Hampshire enacted zoning in 1925 when they adopted RSAs 672 through 679. Those are your planning regulations. The latest addition to that was in 2019, the RSA 679 created the Housing Appeals Board. And the planning and zoning laws, chapters 672 to 679, New Hampshire is a local control state, right? So the municipalities have the option to adopt zoning. And through that, they would follow through with RSA 674-16, which is the grant of power, which in part says that it's for the purposes of promoting the health, safety, and general welfare of the community. And in addition to adopting 674-16, municipalities have the option to adopt, in addition to 16, adopt 17, which is what the purpose of zoning ordinances is. It says, in part, to lessen congestion in streets, provide adequate light and air, prevent overcrowding of land, assure proper use of natural resources, and other public requirements. So if you keep that in mind as to the purposes of zoning ordinances, and then go back and look at this picture, you can see overcrowding of land, height, allow for circulation of air and sunshine. So that's kind of how to understand why we have zoning and what its purposes is, and why New Hampshire went and adopted the land use RSAs and gave the municipalities the choice, the ability to choose whether or not to adopt zoning with the specific purpose to promote health, safety, and general welfare of their community. So it's generally accepted that there are two components of zoning. You have the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. So the zoning ordinance, again, the municipality decides on whether or not they're going to adopt zoning and regulate land uses through their community. And so that's done by adopting RSA, like we've just said, like 674-16, the authority, granted power, 674-17, and 674-18, which is the adoption of zoning ordinances. In addition to the zoning ordinance, RSA 674-20 refers to districts. And in part says, in order to carry out and accomplish the purposes of zoning, the local legislative body may divide the municipality into districts. So as you can see, the zoning map, geographically shows all zoning districts, boundaries, and land use classifications within the zoning ordinance. So the zoning map and the zoning ordinance make up the general term zoning, and they're both amended and utilized the same way as like your community's rule book. So zoning's relationship to the master plan. So the link there is that we all know that I've said before that the master plan is the top of the food chain for your land use regulations, and it is the legal building block for the planning board, legal building block for land use regulations. So in order to have a master plan and have zoning, the planning board has to be established through the community. And then once the planning board is established, they adopt their bylaws. Once the bylaws are adopted, RSA 674-18, which is the adoption of zoning, in part states the local legislative body may adopt a zoning ordinance only after the planning board has adopted mandatory sections of the master plan, as described in 674-1 and 2. So you can have zoning only if you have the two chapters of the master plan, vision and land use. So part of the RSA 674-2-1, so what is the master plan? In part says that the purpose of the master plan is to set down as clearly and practically as possible the best and most appropriate future development of the area under the jurisdiction of the planning board. So the master plan is according to 674-2-1, 2-2, and it's the legal standing for the implementation of land use ordinances. So why it's not really, a legally enforceable document, again, it is that legal building block, because once that master plan has been adopted, and then land use regulations, the zoning ordinance are a result of that of the master plan. It's community-based, meaning that the community decides on the master plan of what they would like development in their community to look like, what types of land uses and what types of locations. That's all spelled out in the master plan. It's community-driven, adopted by the planning board. Then it's the planning board's job and the community's choice to implement regulations that reach the goals and the objectives of the master plan. So in part, the RSA 674-2-2 states the master plan shall be statements of land use development and principles for the municipality with such accompanying maps, diagrams, charts, and descriptions as to give the legal standing for the implementation of ordinances and other measures of the planning board. So the two so that's your relationship. When you get into zoning, you get into master plan, you can't have one without the other. They're both interrelated. And the two required chapters for the master plan are the vision and the land use. So again, this is community-based. So if the community's vision of how they want their community to look like, whether they want tons of open space, whether they want all in, a big industrial park, whatever they want is spelled out in their vision. And then the land use is the complement to that, which says this is what chapters we want. This is the land uses we want. And then the rest of your regulations come from that. So like I said, zoning ordinance is like the rule book for your community, okay? And it's basically, remember that building, it describes and specifies the size, types, and locations of land use and development for your community. So your community has gone along, you have a planning board, you have your master plan, so now it decides it wants to adopt zoning. But before you can adopt zoning, the legislative body will authorize the planning board to review and approve subdivision applications. So therefore, the planning board is authorized to prepare and utilize subdivision regulations according to 674-35. Once that you've got the planning board with a master plan and subdivision regulations, the municipality can decide to adopt zoning, which comes from the legislature will decide. The planning board, through legislative vote, will authorize the planning board to adopt a zoning ordinance. So after the zoning ordinance has been adopted, the planning board can then move further to have, or excuse me, the legislative body can move further to have the planning board adopt site plan regulations. So those are kind of, that's the order it goes, is they're all related and they're all designed to implement the goals and the objectives of the master plan. So the planning board is in charge of subdivision regulations, they're in charge of site plan regulations, they're in charge of the zoning ordinance. There are also other land use regulations that stem from the master plan and that stem from the zoning ordinance, are excavation regulations, driveway regulations, as well as floodplain regulations that are also amended through the zoning ordinance. So basically, what is a zoning amendment? It's a change to the zoning ordinance, which includes language, graphs, tables, maps. And again, that applies to the zoning map. If there's a change in a district boundary or our community wants to add a new district, the map is amended and voted on at town meeting, as well as just the zoning ordinance at town meeting. So what to consider for your zoning amendments? So I think one of the most important things to do for a zoning amendment time is to work with your zoning board, work with your building inspector, work with your code enforcement officer. If you see if there are a lot of applications for variances or special exceptions or a variance from a particular section of the ordinance, it's important to review that and maybe make some changes to the language, because that's a red flag that there's something wrong with your zoning if there's repeat applications over a certain section or a certain definition. Make sure that you're talking with other municipal boards and staff, okay? Like the zoning ordinance is the rule book of your community. So there's other staff, there's other boards, there's other commissions, the general public that is utilizing the zoning ordinance to figure out how and when land uses and what they can and can't do with their property. So it would be important to understand the other people's views and try to figure out if there's language that can be added or taken out or changed that makes it easier for the general public and other staff and board members to work with the zoning ordinance. And my favorite, review the table of permitted uses and against your definitions. You should not have a definition without a corresponding use, nor should you have a use without a corresponding definition. Okay, so make sure, it's really important to make sure that the definitions and the uses, they match, that they're in sync. And if you don't have a good definition of something where you can't decide on a definition, the American Planning Association has a planner's dictionary, which is very helpful for planners terms, or when in doubt, use the dictionary, because your rule book, your zoning ordinance should have plain language, and you should make sure that interpretations are easy to understand, that the definitions are easy to understand, so the plain language works best. Review of your land use, like other land use regulations against your zoning ordinance. Again, don't get into the habit of just amending your zoning ordinance and not paying attention to your other regulations for which the zoning ordinance is based. So especially with your master plan, if your master plan chapters talk about housing and what types of housing, then your zoning ordinance and your other regulations need to reflect that. So just make sure there's that cross-referencing, that what you're doing in the zoning ordinance is not in direct conflict to your other land use regulations. If you've got regulations in your ordinance that adopted from the state RSAs, then I would recommend that you add language that says as amended after your excavation or wetlands or your Comprehensive Shoreline Protection Act. That way, when the state ever amends those RSAs, then your ordinance is up to date with that, and you don't have to worry about your ordinance being out of date with state RSAs. Another thing that I think would be really helpful for boards for the zoning amendment process is to do a housekeeping clause. Review this with your town attorney, see if it's something worthwhile, but any change to the zoning ordinance has to go to town meeting. And if there are typos or grammatical mistakes or an article that's been, repealed, but the chapter and the numbers, anything like that, that doesn't substantially change language, meaning, or intent, then it would be worthwhile for the planning board to be able to clean that up whenever they wanted to, and not just wait to town meeting to remove a chapter of an article or a title from the zoning ordinance.
Stephanie,
Yes,
there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
You want to take it now?
Sure.
It's from Sarah. If the planning board wants to add definitions to the zoning ordinance, would that be considered an amendment and require approval by the legislative body?
Yes. Yep, if your definitions are located in your zoning ordinance and you're making changes to definitions, then that has to go to town meeting, your legislative body.
That was the only one. Thanks,
Okay.
Stephanie.
Thank you. So, what is a zoning amendment continued? So who's in charge? Who's driving the bus? As we're learning, and we all know that the planning board is in charge of the zoning ordinance amendments. A zoning amendment can also be brought forward by your governing body, and also by petition. Governing body would be your selectmen or your councilman. Petitioned amendment is an amendment by 25 or more registered voters of the town. And I'll review that a little bit in the next slide. So your zoning amendment language, I'll get into it a little bit more, but basically this is just a brief kind of outline, just some things to take into consideration when you're creating your zoning amendments. Check your format. All zoning amendments should be in the same format. Are you in favor of blah, blah, blah? Okay, so make sure that all your amendments are going to be under that format, and understand that when you're writing your zoning amendments. The zoning amendment should also include whether or not the planning board supports it or not. And I've seen that either with a vote, or does the planning board recommend yes or no. It's really good pointer to add a clarifying statement, a reasoning statement for the change that helps the public understand why there is this change and what the need for this change is. It's also really helpful for history and record keeping purposes as to why a planning board or a petitioned amendment made those changes. A governmental body amendment and a petition amendment language cannot be changed. Once that's submitted, that's the language is what it moves forward for the ballot. The planning board amendments are the only amendments that can be changed substantially language-wise, at a public meeting. And I will recommend, as a practice pointer here, and also again, just as a reminder for later on, it's a good idea. It's good practice. It's good transparency. If whomever is proposing the zoning amendment to represent it at the public hearings as well as at the polls. If you're making changes to a zoning ordinance and people have questions and you're not there to answer them, it's probably not going to pass. It's not good PR to do that. So if you're proposing a change to the zoning ordinance, you should be there to represent it at the public hearing and at the polls. And that is the same for a planning board. If you've got staff or a planning board member that's able to attend at the polls to answer questions for people, it's good PR, and it's very helpful for people to understand why zoning amendments are being brought forward. So again, quickly, petition zoning amendments are 25 or more registered voters of the town can petition any provision of the zoning ordinance or map to be amended or repealed. They are first submitted to the governing body, and then the governing body then forwards that to the planning board. So the RSA states that the petition amendment shall be submitted to the Board of Selectmen or Village District Commissioners between 120 and 90 days prior to the town or village district meeting, and shall be in correct warrant article form as determined by the selectmen or the commissioners. So again, we're back to that. What is the amendment? You need to make sure you've got the correct format. You can't submit a zoning amendment on a cocktail napkin, right? You got to have the proper format and the proper language that's approved by the town. Once that's been submitted to the village commissioners or the selectmen, then they submit that to the planning board, and it says in a timely manner. So you would hope that that governing body doesn't hang on to the petitioned amendment for too long, but then forwards it to the planning board in a timely manner. And then at that first planning board meeting for a petition zoning amendment, the planning board will accept it and then, acknowledge they've received it and then set a public hearing date for it at that meeting. They're only required to have one for a petitioned amendment because they can't be altered. And they can use that statement, like I said, whether or not the planning board does it by a vote or whether or not it's just a recommendation, the planning board yes or no recommends it. They should also include that on the ballot language of whether or not the planning board supports the petitioned amendment. So again, some best practices. Okay, we're a little bit late this time of year, but the best time to start for zoning amendments is in the summer. And I know it's a drag, and who wants to have an extra meeting or spend more time in the summer working on zoning amendments? But it really is beneficial. And some of my board members, I used to sing to them, it's the most wonderful time of the year, right? You have to get it done. And the earlier you start, the better your zoning amendment process will go and better amendments you could have moving forward. So by starting in the summer, you also may want to consider adding, those sections as a work session meeting where you just focus on zoning amendments. And if you do that, several times, limit the meeting to an hour, do whatever you can, but having additional meetings and starting early in the season is really key to getting good zoning amendments forward. Keep good records of your zoning amendment notices and what moves forward and the language that's changed. And I would even, recommend having an annual folder, zoning amendments 2022, 2023. What did the board work on? Make sure you've got your postings correctly. So if there's ever a case or somebody's challenging a zoning amendment, you have the proof that the postings were proper and within the correct legal time frame. Also, staff members or a board member, keep a running list all year of things that you encounter that from the zoning ordinance or things that you're hearing from the applicants, or again, keeping in touch with other board members and other municipal staff. Keep a running list because it's really helpful for the board to organize themselves for zoning amendment time. Again, don't propose zoning amendments that are going to conflict with any of your land use regulations, especially your master plan. So it's really important that that staff or planning board member is cross-checking those references to make sure that one zoning amendment change isn't going to mess up or confuse or make difficult another section of your land use regulations. And don't take on too many amendments. I think that several is good. And what's several? 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that. You don't want to have too many amendments because you're risking that the public or the approval rating is going to go down with too many amendments. Especially if there's 1 year where you've got, a large section of your ordinance to amend and it's a lot of words, a lot of language. You don't want to also throw 5, 6, 7 more amendments to be approved. So just be aware of how many, because it's important to make sure that things are clear, and you don't want to bombard the public with tons of amendments. Taking advantage of RSA 676-12 is also key, especially so you're starting early in the summer, you're adding another meeting, you've got your running list going, you're cross-referencing with all, the rest of your regulations, you're ready to go. So RSA 676-12 says that the building inspector shall not issue any building permit within 120 days prior to the annual or special village district meeting, if the application for such permit is made after the first legal notice of the proposed changes to the building code or zoning ordinances has been posted pursuant to the noticing things. So what that means is that your town 120 days prior to your town meeting is when you can have your first public hearing for zoning amendments. And I used to take advantage of this, a lot in municipal planning because it gave us the chance to get some of the easier ones. We didn't have a housekeeping clause, so if there were little zoning amendments that we had to change, we could take care of those, have one public hearing, and be done with it, and then go and work on our more, sophisticated zoning amendments. So if you're able to, pay attention to the RSA and the dates of when your town meeting is. And there's also in the NHMA and our zoning amendment calendars at OPD, we list the dates of when you can have your first public hearing based on when your town meeting is. And don't forget your town attorney. We don't want zoning amendments to be written by an attorney, but they need to be approved by an attorney, right? Your zoning ordinance should be basic language. It's your rule book. Everybody should have a pretty good understanding of it. Most of the people should have a pretty good understanding of it, but don't make it worse by adding language that's very difficult to read, to understand, and to interpret. Okay, the legislative process. So we all know town meeting, right? So in towns, you've got one chance, one bite at the apple, once a year, or unless there's a special meeting called that for the town meeting, you can amend your zoning ordinance. In cities or in town councils, towns, depending on your charter, amendments can be made at any time of the year. So the cities and towns that have whatever their charter says have the distinct advantage of being able to amend more than just once a year.
Stephanie?
Alvina, we have a question?
Yep,
Okay.
we do. It's from Audrey. Building permits restricted. How about jurisdictions with councils?
Jurisdictions with what?
Councils. Like the city council, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah, she confirmed it was like the city councils. Building permits restricted. How about, so it's not for town meetings. So how do you do amendments if you're not a town? If you're a
it's
city?
through the governing body. But the RSA talks about the building permit being issued. But if it's not town meeting, then it's the governing body anyway that does the.
So is there a 120-day limitation for cities?
Well, it's based on the building permit. Based on the building inspector. Wait, where's that? Where did the RSA? Whoops, going backwards. The building inspector, so I assume a city has a building inspector. So it's the building inspector shall not issue any building permit with 120 days. If it's the city council that's doing the building inspecting, then I would interpret it that way. But the application for such permit is made after the first legal notice of proposed changes to the building code or zoning ordinance has been posted pursuant to the provisions of RSA 675-7. So whether it's a city or a town, I'm assuming that there's still a building inspector. So that's the building inspector shall not issue anything prior to 120 days. Does that make sense? Did that answer a question?
Audrey, I don't know.
It's a town or village district meeting.
No, she says it hasn't. Sorry.
So, so for the building, so that it says 120 days for the special town or village district meeting.
So if there is no town meeting, if it's the legislative body doing the zoning amendments in cities.
Cities can amend any time, so correct. So that's all right. I was focused on the building inspector. Correct. Cities can amend any time they want.
So
they have
what
to file
happens
the notices.
to that, to the building inspection, to the building permits in this case?
It's for, yes. Yeah. So it's the building inspector and the town and village district meeting form of government. The cities can change zoning at any time of the year. So they don't need 120 days. They don't need that buffer kind of thing. But when you've got town meeting once a year, then you can go 120 days, whether it's in your May or April or your March town meeting, your village district, go 120 days prior to that. And then that's when you can hold your first public hearing, which then means that if the zoning amendment comes in that's based on that section that's being amended, that the building inspector can issue building permits. So you've got this kind of stay as far as when something is posted and when something is submitted. Don't know if that cleared it up or hope it didn't make it worse.
I haven't heard from Audrey yet, but.
Okay.
So she's asking, we might have amendments that have had a public hearing. The amendment might hang out there for months, more than 120 days.
Well, once you've had your public hearing, it's done, it's completed, and then you just move forward and put it on the ballot. So if you've had your
I'm
public
assuming
hearing,
Audrey's from a city, so she's more concerned about the city type zoning amendment.
well,
And the,
if you've had a public hearing, the planning board has to have a public hearing in a city or in a town, right? So if the planning board has had the public hearing, then who's ever in charge of moving that forward to the city council or to town council, if that's a form of government, what the charter says, then it's an administrative process, because the planning board has already done their role. They've already done one public hearing for it. So the city council or town council, whatever the charter says, they're proposing a zoning amendment. The planning board proposes a zoning amendment, petition zoning amendment. You have one public hearing. If that's all that you need for a petition, or then that moves to the city council. That's out of the planning board's hands. So if you have zoning amendments that are hanging out there for a long time, then maybe something should just kind of be reviewed with city council or with the planning board as to why these amendments have been moved forward and haven't been brought to a vote.
thank
Okay,
you, Stephanie.
hopefully, all right. Hopefully, thanks. A little bit, thanks for asking those questions.
So there's another question from
Sure.
Emily. Planning board has held the public hearing. Are all permits on hold until a vote occurs in this same scenario?
That relate to the amendment that is, so if you've got a, let me go back.
In a town council form of government. So between the public hearing, after the public hearing, until the council votes, what happens to the permits?
They can't move forward until it's approved. They're in limbo. Normally, a building inspector's got 30 days anyway to review a permit. But if that applicant is taking the risk of submitting something, so you've had a public hearing, they haven't approved it yet. They're going to approve it at the next council meeting. I submit a building permit. So it's up to technically the building inspector's got 30 days to review it anyway. But it's not in effect until that amendment is passed. So that's why the building inspectors aren't going to be issuing permits, because if it passes, then they've just approved something that's non-conforming. And so it stays there, and no permits should be issued until that amendment is resolved, whether that's town meeting or town council or city council, board of aldermen, whatever. Okay. So let's see, just to wrap up a little bit of that. So the planning board must hold at least one public hearing and so public hearing notices. So again, we've got 10 calendar day notice. Notice shall be given to the public with the date, time, and location. And that is 10 days prior to the hearing, which does not include the day of the posting or the day of the meeting. The notice also shall be published in a newspaper in general circulation of the municipality, or the alternative, it can be posted on your municipality's website. So the RSA states that in lieu of publication in a paper of general circulation, notice may be posted of the municipality's website if it exists. And if you're using the municipality's website in lieu of the general circulation in a newspaper, the notice shall appear prominently on the website's homepage, or a link directly to the notice shall be made prominent on the website's homepage. It should be posted at the time stated in the previous paragraph and shall remain on the website until the conclusion of the hearing. It still needs to be posted in 2 other public places. Anyone in town can request that the municipality mail them specifically a notice of all public hearing on zoning amendments. The municipality could do that either electronically or by first class mail. And that's the cost to their municipality. The full text of the zoning amendments are not required for the public hearing notice. The full text of the zoning amendments are required on the ballot only. So you don't have to publish or put on the website the notice of public hearing that contains the zoning amendment, but at some point you have to have the full language, whether on the website or available at the municipal building for the public to review. For notification, if the zoning amendment proposal changes the boundary of a zoning district that affects 100 or fewer properties, then the municipality is required to notice each individual property owner within that district. If the amendment changes the minimum lot size or permitted uses for that same threshold for 100 or few property owners, 100 or fewer property owners in that district, then the municipality shall pay to notice each individual owner. The notice must be sent by first class to the address that's used for the tax bill purposes. And in the case, if the zoning amendment is a petition zoning amendment that is changing the boundaries or the uses, then it is the petitioner that pays to notice each of the property owners that will be affected. So the official ballot requirements, again, from zoning ordinance language, amendments. I spoke a little bit about how it needs to be cleared and what type of format. So with the municipal clerk should be working with the planning board or staff to come up with that template. And again, the generally accepted language for the zoning amendments, it has the language of, are you in favor of the adoption of the amendment to the town zoning ordinance as proposed by the planning board as follows, and then insert your amendment there, and make sure also that you're including, you know, Article 5, Section 2, Roman numeral A, B. You have to make sure numerically that you're identifying that section of the ordinance in your zoning amendment. Again, to review that most zoning amendments should have the planning board support, whether it's by a vote or whether it's by recommend or not recommend, that should be included on the ballot. You should also, again, like I said, in best practices, is you should make sure that there is a sentence or a statement of clarity or reasoning for the zoning amendment, and make sure that you're not taking up too much space through the whole warrant with too much reason for history and things like that. So one or two sentences is clear. It's good information for the public to understand why the planning board or even a petition amendment is being brought forward. So the official, after the second public hearing, after your public hearings are done with your zoning amendments, then an official copy is placed on file with your municipal clerk. And after that, so for a town meeting, that's no later than the fifth Tuesday prior to when the date of the action is going to take place. So remember that once those final public hearings have been done, you've sent it in, it's on file. This is what's going to be on the warrant. They can't be changed after that. So just remember that, you know, your language needs to be clear and finalized, and then there's no changing the language after it's on, after it's been submitted to the clerk. So what's new in 22? HB 1661, if you haven't heard, kind of got a lot of attention this year with some changes to the planning and zoning laws and practices. Now, NHMA attorneys and OPD staff, along with other planners and land use attorneys in the state, worked this summer to come up with a kind of a guidance document, and that link, changes to planning and zoning laws in 2022, is a direct article that NHMA put out with some guidance on the changes that came about as a result. And I will say, you're going to hear me say over and over and over that it's crucial that for these changes that you consult with your town attorney. So the first section that was a result of 1661 was section 70, which, in addition to OPD requiring to provide training materials, we also now have optional tests that planning board members can take, and the links are there in the slides if you're interested in taking the test. It's completely confidential. You can choose to have a certificate or not. But again, it's something that OPD is required to do in addition to all the training that we already do. And so you can take the tests, see how you do. Section 71 requires any fee a city or town imposes on an applicant shall be published in a location accessible to the public during normal business hours. And if it's not, that fee should be waived. So that does include your land use boards, planning board, zoning board, historic district commission, code enforcement officer, building inspector, building code of appeals, everybody that charges fees. Just make sure that they're published and made available to the public. Section 72 is effective next year, July of 2023. So this may be one that should probably move up the list if you're considering zoning for zoning amendment consideration this year, because it's directly related to workforce housing and elderly housing. So if you've got an elderly housing section of your zoning ordinance, if you've got until July 2023 to make changes to that ordinance, because if to address maybe workforce housing. So if you don't make changes to that ordinance in 2020 by July 1st of 2023, then any workforce housing application that comes to your community will be reviewed and approved, or go through the process underneath your elderly housing ordinance. So again, talk with your town attorney, review the sections of the ordinance. If you have an elderly housing section of your ordinance, review that and with your town attorney. Section 70, yes.
You want to do questions now? There's a couple
Sure.
there.
Okay.
All right, so the first one has to do with the wording. Oh, that was just deleted. Audrey was asking. So what type of incentives were contemplated?
This section 72 for the elderly housing. Is that the one? It specifically says increased density, reduced lot size, expedited approval, or other dimensional or incentives to housing for older persons. That depends on what else is in your ordinance. And that's something, again, to review with your town attorney. Because those are just listed incentives. Your ordinance may have additional incentives, maybe, reduced buffers or whatever the case may be, or increased buffers. But that's something that you'll need to review with your town attorney to make sure. I hope that answered your question.
That's it for now. We haven't heard from Dave yet, but procedural incentives are also included. That is from Noah.
Okay, thanks, Noah.
And Dave said okay.
Okay, perfect. Okay, section 73. This, again, stuff that you need to review with your town attorney. So this requires all land use boards, according to 672(7), to provide specific written findings of fact that support an approval or for a disapproval. And findings of fact do not replace conditions of approval. Okay, they're in addition to. So what this means is that if you review the article and kind of review the materials that NHMA has put out, findings of fact are based on the board saying that you've met our requirements. The findings of fact to you, this application meets our checklist requirements, meets our application requirements, but they need to be, highlighted and itemized, which are different from your conditions of approval. So again, something that you need to, work with your town attorney. I would suggest maybe even having a work session with your town attorney to go over all these things that are now going to be required of planning boards, the laws that are changing, the regulations that need to be updated. But it's really important to understand that findings of fact are your clarification as to why this was approved, and they are not to replace conditions of approval. Effective July, and again, most of these are already into effect. So as you can see, so it's important to make sure that you've got an understanding of them and that you're starting to work on that process. Section 74, the ZBAs have 90 days to begin consideration to approve or disapprove. unless the applicant agrees to an extension. So ZBAs, you should be looking at your rules of procedure and make sure that you've got the correct timelines in there, and rules of procedure can be adopted at just a public hearing that's held. But again, you need to be checking all of your regulations to make sure that they're up to date with these proposals, that the majority of them are already into effect. Another one, again, talk to your town attorney about all of these. The planning board 65-day statutory timeline has been altered a little bit. So it is important that planning boards understand that and understand how it affects their decision making. And so again, make sure that you're going through your town attorney of these things to be aware of, and if whether or not you need to update rules of procedure, zoning ordinance, or etc. Section 76, which took effect in August, again, most of these taking effect in August, it eliminated the ability of the planning board to request an extension from the governing body to take final action on an application. So again, these are types of things that need to be updated in your rules of procedure or in other land use regulations. But the planning board no longer has the ability to ask the governing body for an extension.
Stephanie?
Yes, ma'am.
So the question is from Andrew. This is a change for planning board rules of procedure and zoning ordinance, or both.
Which one?
And I think this was on the previous slide.
On the previous one.
It might be the 30 days.
The 30 days. That would be a little bit more, I think, of the procedures. Because, you know, your rules of procedures would outline what happens when you get 65 days to review. So those types of, so the planning board ones, that this one is January 23rd, January of 2023, excuse me. That would be, you know, planning board approval, unless there's somewhere in your zoning ordinance that does discuss that. So that's why you have to check that. But it is, most of these are like rules of procedure.
Oh, he was asking about findings of fact.
Findings of fact. Findings of fact, that's rules of procedure. So when the planning board opens a public hearing and the rules of procedure describe how a planning board handles an application, then it may be worthwhile to consult with your town attorney and discuss what the findings of fact are and what that process is, what it's related to, what are they based on. Again, your town attorney is the best one to guide you, but these are the types of things that you should be aware of to make sure that your rules of procedure, the planning board and zoning board, that you're keeping up to date with the RSA changes that affect your procedures. Okay, so section 76 eliminated the ability of the planning board to request an extension from the governing body to take final action on an application. 77, that has to deal with fee and shifting and bonding for parties that are appealing. Section 78 and 79, they are now working for TIFs. So they've now changed that housing can be located in TIFs, as well as municipalities can acquire property for TIFs for to construct housing that meet the definition of workforce housing. Now, that can't be done by eminent domain, but the municipality can now build their own workforce housing. So you want to make sure that the your TIF districts, that your ordinance, or excuse me, your boundaries and your ordinance, yes, would may need to be updated to include residential uses. So again, just a quick review of what's new in 22, and I really encourage you to have a specific meeting with your town attorney, go through these things. What does it mean? What are the findings of fact? What do you mean with that? What does the 65-day timeline change mean? What does the 90-day? All of those things need to be updated. They're already into effect. So, you know, make sure that you're meeting those as best you can, getting them done with your town attorney. Same with your land use fees. If you don't post your land use fees to the public, an application can come in. They're not to be charged any fees. Again, your elderly housing, review your elderly housing ordinance if you have it and what the standards are for that. Because if you don't change those standards by July 1st of 2023 and a workforce housing development comes to your community, It's going to be reviewed and approved through your elderly housing. So make sure those the standards that you want for workforce housing, that's fine, then don't make any changes, but just make sure that you're aware of that and that you're reviewing those ordinance again with your town attorney, possibly solicit the RPCs if you need help, if there's no planning staff. But this is your one town meeting to be able to address that. So I would put that high on the priority list.
Stephanie, there's another question from Dave. He's asking, can a municipality unilaterally build workforce housing on a tax deeded property?
If the municipality owns the property, I mean, that's what in a TIF district or in general.
He didn't specify, just says tax deeded property.
I would check with your town attorney. I mean, I'm referring to in general. I would check with your town attorney, Dave, because I'm not sure how they would do that. But if it's a TIF district, now does allow a municipality to require real property and to do that. But I would check with your town attorney on that.
He said, okay.
Okay, thank you. So again, review your ordinances, sit down with your town attorney, planning board timelines, again, the 65-day, all those kinds of things are stuff that need to be reviewed with your town attorney, specifically for zoning amendments, elderly housing, TIF districts and boundaries, your planning board timelines, review your rules of procedure. Again, rules of procedure aren't, zoning amendments, but it is important to make sure that they're being taken care of and that you're addressing them in your rules of procedure, because if a situation arises and you're not up to date, your town's going to get into a little bit of, legal trouble that way. So few more resources to consider for your zoning amendment time. The Office of Planning and Development and New Hampshire Municipal Association, we publish our zoning amendment calendars, and the links in the slides will bring you to those zoning amendment calendars. Really important to keep track of the timing. The American Planning Association website, NECAPA, the RPCs, and then a little link there to Webster's Dictionary to help you out with basic definitions. So that's my contact information. If you have any additional questions that come up, you can email me or call us or reach us to our website. Our next plan webinar series is November 10th, when we have Jen Rowden from the Rockingham Planning Commission. She's going to be providing an overview of the Resilient Land Use Guide for New Hampshire, and feel free to utilize the link to look at that guide. And don't forget that we also have our survey up that for people who've taken our webinars to let us know how we're doing, and visit our website training page for upcoming events and history of our previous webinars.
You ready for another question, Stephanie?
Sure. So thank you.
So that's from Andrew. Does a TIF district have to be specified in the zoning ordinance?
I'm not sure. Well, my reading of RSA 162.12 is that the community has to adopt it, the legislative body. So I'm interpreting that it maybe doesn't necessarily have to be in the zoning ordinance, but it is an ordinance that is adopted by the legislative body. So however that, amendment to that type of thing to take place, I would assume it would be a zoning amendment. But you may check with your town attorney, but even if it's a standalone ordinance, and the legislative body has chosen to adopt it, then, go through that amendment process depending on your legislative body.
Thank you, Stephanie.
You're welcome.
From Andrew. I don't see any other questions in the chat yet.
Okay. Any other questions before we wrap up?
I don't see any. I have a
Okay.
question, Stephanie,
Okay,
actually.
sure.
How do you suggest to keep track of the zoning amendments for each year? What is the best way to do it, or if are there any best management practices, or for history purposes, you know,
I think that when I was land use administrator and staff, what I did was I kept a particular folder for every year. So every year I had zoning amendments. I kept my list going, what was discussed, what the planning board did, what they didn't do, what was petitioned. And make sure that you've got your notice of public hearing in there, whether now it's on a website, but just that way it's good history keeping. It's helpful for the planning board. They're going to forget staff changes. You're going to forget, what did we talk about 2 years ago? Keep an individual zoning amendment folder for each year. I think that's the best way to do it, plus with the minutes as well.
Is there, you know, some ordinances have listed short, you know, have a section of amendments history. Do you suggest that's a good idea to start or to keep?
It can be, you know, it depends on how well it's done. It can be a little confusing. Some municipalities keep the amendment changes right on the front page. Other zoning ordinances I've seen where they put the, you know, amended such and such right in that section. So whatever that community is comfortable with is fine. But like the most important thing to try to remember again, that this is your community's rule book, and your rule book should be easily accessible, easily understandable to the public. So if you're putting, you know, information in there about when something was amended, then that's just being available to the public and being transparent, and it helps for record keeping and for history and for clarification.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Sure, you're welcome. Also helps to determine nonconformities. If, you know, something was approved and permitted in 2010 and then in 2020 they did away with that kind of thing. So when you know that you're keeping track of when your zoning ordinance was amended, it can help determine nonconformities.
No more questions.
Okay.
Looks like.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. And we will see you in November for a Resilient Land Use Guide in New Hampshire presentation. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.